Welcome to JAPS Finland podcast. I'm Varpu Haavisto, the chairman of JAPS Finland. Today I have Naomi Linder-Khan as my guest. Naomi is the director of the international division at Regavim, an Israeli think tank and expert organization concentrating in documenting the land use in Judea and Samaria, or West Bank. Naomi, it's lovely to see you again. And thank you for taking your precious time for this interview.
Always a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you. I hope you and your loved ones are doing well despite of the still ongoing war in the north and all the other hostile fronts Israel and Israelis are facing today. Yeah, on top of the physical war and terrorism, Israel and Israelis face growing hostility and pressure from the outside world, not least from our continent, Europe. A growing front of NGOs has been working for boycotting and sanctioning Israel and Israeli entities and individuals since the infamous Durban conference 25 years ago. They address the hostility in the language of virtuous human rights. On Monday this week, they reached one dangerous milestone when the European Foreign Ministers' Council announced sanctions on 4 Israeli organizations and several of their leaders based on involvement in settler violence in the West Bank or Judea and Samaria. One of the targeted organizations is Regavim. So Naomi, you are the head of the international department at Regavim. Is Regavim a violent settler movement? What are you actually doing?
Regavim is a research and policy institute. We are not a settlement organization per se, meaning we don't build settlements. We advocate for the right of Israelis to live in our ancestral homeland. We advocate for the rights of the state of Israel as in terms of sovereignty in Judea and Samaria, but we do not take active steps on the ground one way or the other because we are a research and policy institute. And that is what is so alarming about these recent the threat of sanctions. Again, nothing official has been released yet, and I believe that the European Parliament is using that amorphous kind of announcement as a scare tactic to sort of create this threat, to create this cloud that they hope will cause us to cower in fear and to discredit us in some way without actually doing anything. I have no doubt that they will eventually issue an official sanctions statement, but it is absolutely ridiculous that they think that the method that was created for democratic countries to contend with international crime syndicates, drug lords, and terrorists and terrorist organizations should be applied to a law-abiding, legally registered research institute simply because they don't like the opinions that we espouse.
Yeah. At the same time, the EU foreign ministers announced that they would sanction actually Hamas leaders, but their names have not been published. So what do you think of this kind of analogy?
Well, I think that putting both Hamas and an organization like Regavim in the same framework is in itself an outrage. Placing in the same framework sanctions against an internationally sanctioned terror organization that has carried out atrocities and is sworn to murder and terrorism, and comparing that somehow or other, or placing us in the same framework as a law-abiding research institute that has always, from the day it was founded, worked through the judicial system and through policy instruments in a democratic allied country, that's outrageous to create that parallel. And I believe will be an extremely bad precedent if it actually continues through to the final stage.
I understand that the basis for being placed on the sanction list for terrorism is an investigation and a verdict by a national court. But in your case, when an expert organization is put on the sanctioned list on political reasons, the underlying evidence is actually reporting by politically hostile NGOs, which has not been properly challenged or investigated. But I mean, do you have any? I mean, have you received any notice on the reasons or about the evidence behind the sanctions?
Absolutely no evidence. Absolutely no contact has been made with us in any way, which is quite suspicious. I'll put it that way. We, for almost 20 years, have been suing the government of Israel regarding its failure to enforce the law against illegal European Union activity. The European Union sits on the same bench in court, or its representatives do, sits on the same bench in court as we for 20 years almost, and all of a sudden now doesn't know how to contact us or how to clarify any of these things. I think it's quite transparent that they have no interest in dialogue or in even ascertaining the factual basis for any of their accusations. We don't even know what the accusations are. What I will tell you is, this is going back a few years already, over 2 years ago, we received word from internal sources that the European Union was already attempting to find some sort of excuse to issue sanctions against Regavim. And the things they were accusing us then of what had to do with a petition that we submitted to the court in Israel against an illegally constructed school. This school was built with European funds and European legal protection, obviously, on Israeli state land in a historic site at the foot of the Herodium. It's a tremendously significant ancient site, the burial place of King Herod, and an illegal school was constructed there. The school was found to be dangerous if children actually ever used that school. It was built in such a way as to pose a serious physical danger to anyone who went inside, because obviously it wasn't really meant to meet any educational needs. It was meant as a tactic for taking over Israeli state land in Area C. So we petitioned against this illegal school, and the court found that the school did pose a danger and ordered the school demolished and removed from the area. And on those grounds, the European Union wanted to use that as the grounds for sanctioning Regavim for some sort of violence or dispossession of someone or other, even though the school was built illegally on a national historic site and posed a physical danger to children. And we were not the ones who demolished it, but the Israeli authorities demolished it by order of the Israeli court. So you can see how far-fetched even the proof that we do know of, the excuse that we do know about, is so far-fetched as to make these sanctions patently ridiculous.
The EU claims that its construction work or the construction work, its funding is humanitarian aid, but however, everywhere else, humanitarian aid for construction means rebuilding infrastructure destroyed by natural disasters or wars. Only in Judea and Samaria hills, which are strategically vital to Israel, it has meant totally new construction. And this is done by the EU in violation of international agreements signed by the EU, like the Oslo Accords, according to which the permits for construction in Area C must be sought from the Israeli authorities. Like EU is funding the organization called West Bank Protection Consortium, and I think this organization openly defy these international agreements. Is this because the Palestinians do not have space to build in areas A and B where they do not need permits from the Israeli authorities to build?
Well, we asked ourselves the same question, and then we carried out the same type of research that we do in areas under Israeli jurisdiction. We simply examined aerial photography of those areas under Palestinian Authority jurisdiction. Our previous mapping project of those areas determined that almost 70% of areas under Palestinian Authority jurisdiction are empty and available for construction, and require no involvement with the Israeli authorities, no permission, no permits, nothing at all. So it would make most sense for the Palestinian Authority to invest its massive resources, the massive international aid it receives, in areas that are not susceptible to demolition and will have no political fallout. But clearly, the construction that they do carry out in Area C is politically motivated. It does not actually respond to any real housing need. And in fact, the Palestinian Authority incentivizes and encourages Arabs living in areas A and B to move into Area C in order to help take control of the area. This is a clear violation of the underlying principles of the Oslo framework that divided the territory and placed over 95% of the Arabs of the West Bank under Palestinian Authority autonomous rule. By encouraging them to move into areas of Israeli jurisdiction, you're essentially undermining the entire logic behind creating autonomous zones and using people as pawns in a master plan for annexation of the territory.
So actually, the funding of construction is trying to create political facts on ground and create a political solution by creating these facts on ground. It's not humanitarian work.
And this is it's 100% a violation of the principles that were behind creating the Palestinian Authority, creating the Oslo framework, so that there could be a negotiated rather than a unilateral creation of areas of autonomy. I would also point out that this shouldn't come as a surprise, because as far back as 2009, the Palestinian Authority announced that the Oslo framework was no longer binding and would be abandoned in favor of unilateral steps to create a de facto Palestinian state on the entirety of the West Bank. This is a violation of the Oslo framework and should have been immediately responded to by the signatories to the Oslo Accords, including the European Union. But rather than condemning the Palestinian Authority's breach of international agreements and international law, they began to support it. And that is unprecedented and almost unimaginable.
Yes, yes. And in addition to that, there are problems in terms of security and nature preservation, which have arisen as a result of this illegal construction by the Palestinians, supported by the EU. Would you like to tell something about this?
Yes. I think it's part of the research that we do when we document the illegal construction that the European Union is supporting, funding, and defending. Part of the things that we find are the massive ecological damage that are caused by these projects. When they build illegal structures inside delicate nature reserves with ecosystems that are unique in the world and are also the larger environment for such massively important ecological elements such as the Dead Sea or the Judean Desert, all of these illegal projects are causing irreparable environmental harm. The construction that they carry out is not connected to any sort of sewage system. They are running water into protected desert ecosystems and completely disrupting the flora, the fauna, the entire water table. All of these things are being massively impacted by illegal European Union construction. In addition to that, the illegal outposts that they are instrumental in creating have no garbage removal, have no sewage systems. They are polluting streams. They are polluting the groundwater. They are causing pollution of wells and streams, all through a very, very sensitive ecosystem. And the government of Israel has been afraid to address these problems simply because it means confronting the entire European Union and demanding that they cease and desist. But the Europeans would never dream of causing environmental damage on this scale anywhere else in the world.
Yes.
Here to say that this is somehow humanitarian is a travesty.
Yeah. By the way, the NGOs that are producing the reports on which the sanctions were based, I understand that the EU has first paid generously to these same organizations to produce the reporting hostile to Israel. So producing that data is the basis for funding these organizations. And when they have produced it, then EU uses these reports uncritically as the basis for its own political decisions. Is this the case, or have I understood correctly? And how does
understood correctly? It's very hard to grasp how circular this entire system is. They've essentially created an anti-Israel ecosystem. It's an echo chamber. So the European Union funds specific nonprofit organizations here on the ground in Israel, some of which have actually been proven to have fabricated evidence in the past on other issues, but they fund them very, very generously, and I'm talking about tens of millions of euros, to create this narrative, to document or to do whatever it takes to bring evidence that there is a serious phenomenon of settler violence that delegitimizes not only the Jewish communities of Judea and Samaria, but also the IDF, which protects those communities, and by inference, the state of Israel as a whole, as somehow supporting wanton violence, racially motivated or nationalist motivated violence. Unfortunately, we are unable to say that there is no violence among the Jewish community of Judea and Samaria, but the rate, the scope of that violence has been so wildly exaggerated and magnified by these EU-funded campaign managers and these NGOs that are paid to create this narrative and to push this narrative out. It is clear that this is a very carefully orchestrated campaign that's been going on for years and has gained momentum. It gained momentum, particularly after the outbreak of the war on October 7th, 2023, simply to try to paint the Israeli communities of Judea and Samaria as somehow as bad or even worse than Hamas, which slaughtered, raped, incinerated human beings alive, and continues to support those activities. The rate of violence in the communities, the Israeli communities in Judea and Samaria, is lower than the rate of violence in any other community in Israel, but it is magnified hundreds of times and echoed, and unsubstantiated reports are that are pushed out by these EU-paid NGOs are parroted in every anti-Israel media outlet in the world, and that is very, very, very serious problem. People owe it to themselves to question the sources of the information and to actually try to dig down into the actual data. Very, very often what we find is an outrageous incident of settler violence is reported, and a couple of days later, the actual facts of the case are revealed, but they get a very small, minor back page correction, if at all, after the damage to Israel's image and the image of the communities of Judea and Samaria has already been done.
Yeah, I've heard that Regavim has also revealed that what data UN OCHA's settler violence statistics are based on. The
Yes.
entire narrative about violent settlers is heavily based on this UN statistics. Can you tell us more about this, and how did you get hands on the information that forms the basis of the UN OCHA interactive database?
When we began to see that the issue of quote-unquote settler violence was having real-world impact, that it resulted in arms embargoes during a time of an existential war and sanctions, even by our greatest ally, we began to ask, what are these sanctions based on? Where is the data coming from? What is impacting the decision makers to sanction Israeli organizations and individuals? And the answer was the data comes from the United Nations. The United Nations is theoretically a very unbiased, impartial, global entity. And so we went onto the United Nations website that deals specifically with these issues. There is a branch of the United Nations called the Office of Coordination for Humanitarian Affairs, OCHA, we call it OCHA. And they have a dashboard which anyone can access. I encourage you to do so. It's the dashboard of violence in the occupied Palestinian territories. That's how they refer to this entire area. And it gives you statistics which you can filter by place, by area, by perpetrator, by victim, by date, of course, ranges of dates and all of those things. And it shows you graphs, who the victims are by age, by location. But the statistics, the graphs were very misleading. When you take a closer look at the dashboard itself, we already had a red flag, because on the dashboard, towards the bottom, underneath all the graphs, it explains what's included and what's not. And one of the things that's included, the data for Arab casualties and fatalities, also includes people who are hurt or killed while in the act of carrying out terror attacks. In other words, if an Arab attacks an Israeli, either a soldier or a civilian, or invades an Israeli's home, or attacks them on the road, and is either harmed or killed in the process, they are counted as victims of settler violence. And that began to sound some alarm bells, for me at least. What else is included here? If you're saying that terrorists who are killed in action are victims of settler violence, what else are you counting? So on the dashboard, on the right-hand side of the page, it says, click here for the full data set. So I did that. And the response we got back was that the data set is only available to partner organizations, any organization that is a partner on the ground with OCHA. So what implied to be a partner organization, being that we are a research institute and we would like to know what the facts are. And OCHA declined. They refused to allow us to partner with them or to share their data. So we actually worked with a criminologist based in France who asked for the data and was given the data for a 10-year period. Some of that data we had to discount because it was the first 3 years of the 10 years, they said were entries of old statistics and not taken live. So we couldn't actually determine. They simply uploaded block figures. So we went only for the 7-year period in which we had specific line by line incident reports. And what we found was shocking. What we found was that vast majority of the data incident, the violent incidents that were reported were non-existent. First, right off the bat, out of over 8,300 incident reports, over 2,000 of them were actually mislabeled. They were Arab attacks against Israelis rather than the other way around. So we were left with a grand total of 6,332 incident reports. When we went through them, what we found was that 95% at least did not involve settlers. They were confrontations between Arabs and Israeli security forces. So of the remaining small percentage, around 700 incidents even during that time period, we found some other shocking things. Most of the incidents either didn't involve violence, didn't involve settlers, or didn't happen in Judea and Samaria. So visits, peaceful, legal, supervised visits by non-Muslims to the Temple Mount are recorded as storming Al-Aqsa, trespass, threatening, somehow settler violence, when no violence occurred. The people who made the visit weren't necessarily settlers, and it happened in Jerusalem, not in Judea and Samaria. That was one whole category that we had to discount. When the Israeli...
Can I ask about that one? Did they include like Jewish visits on the Temple Mount, or everyone who is non-Muslim?
Well, the way the things are set up on the Temple Mount for visits are that there are only certain hours that are open for visitors who are Jewish. Now, during those hours, people who are not Jewish can also go with the people who are Jewish. But for the rest of the time, the Temple Mount is closed for Muslims only. And so there's a different entrance and there's different time. We do not know if they stood at the gate and checked the nationality or the religion of the people who went up during those times that were available for Jews to visit.
We have been, by the way, we have been there during these years.
They were guilty of settler violence.
I didn't know.
So yes, that data we discounted. We discounted in addition things that have absolutely no connection to violence. For example, if the government of Israel decides to do road improvements on a road in Area C on Israeli public land, not taking anyone's private property, not impounding anything, not invading anyone's private space, but simply improving a road that is used by Jews and Arabs alike in Area C, that is considered by the United Nations Office of Coordination for Humanitarian Affairs, that is listed as settler violence.
By the way, isn't that their obligation? As even if Israel is considered as an occupying power, isn't that an obligation for them to improve the infrastructure on the areas? Yeah.
Absolutely. The Geneva Conventions, even before anyone dreamed up the Oslo framework, the Geneva Conventions require an occupying power, which Israel, again, is not. But even if you consider Israel to be an occupying power, it has an obligation to carry out infrastructure improvements and to make life livable for the people under its jurisdiction. Listing those things as settler violence, aside from everything else, is a violation of law, and it is an affront to common sense. And it is clearly motivated by something other than a search for truth or protection of human rights. It is clearly a very carefully constructed narrative, and it also explains why the United Nations was not really willing to share the raw data, because I think they know very well how ridiculous it is. Other things that were included as incidents of settler violence included, for example, car accidents in Area C. Unfortunately, they happen. If a car accident involves a Palestinian Arab and an Israeli, it is listed as settler violence, no matter who was at fault, no matter what the outcome was. It is listed by the United Nations as settler violence. Absolute absurdity. In addition to that, we had things like class trips of Israeli children to sites of historical or religious significance. For example, a class trip to Shiloh to see the place of the original tabernacle is listed as settler violence. Now, I don't know where the children who went on that class trip are from. Are they settlers, or are they simply Israeli children from Herzliya or Bat Yam? I have no idea. There was no violence. There was nothing illegal about it. It is a completely normal and natural thing for a class trip to go and visit a historic site, but that is listed as settler violence. We even found the incidents like an Arab laborer in one of the Jewish communities in Judea and Samaria was bitten by a dog, and that was listed as settler violence. I'm not saying there are no incidents in which there is Jewish vigilantism, in which troublemakers go out looking for trouble and find it, and when they don't find it, they create it. Unfortunately, that is a problem. And the government of Israel has invested incredible resources to fight those phenomena. And the government of Israel and its entire education system and community leaders and religious leaders and educational leaders are all working to bring those, what do we call them, fringe elements under control, to educate against taking a law into your own hands, to educate against violence of any kind. The level of violence is extremely small. As a matter of fact, according to Israel police data, Judea and Samaria has the lowest crime rate in Israel, and that
Amazing.
and that
think
is the lowest crime rate among most Western countries. So
yeah. Well, racism and racist violence exist everywhere, also in Western countries, but not to speak of like the rest of the world. I would like to know about the full picture of violence in Judea and Samaria, like the Palestinian violence towards the Jews in those areas. So
yes.
compared to this,
Yes. So again, when we receive the data from the United Nations through our French criminologist, we were presented with essentially 6,832 incident reports covering a 7-year period. In the 6 months since the beginning of this year, there have been more violent acts by Arabs against Jews in Judea and Samaria than there were in that entire 7-year period. Even if you take the specious, ridiculous data provided by the United Nations, there were more Arab attacks in the 6 months in the first 6 months of this year, meaning from December 2025 through today, by Arabs against Jews than there were in that entire 7-year period that they reported.
Yeah, and the Arab violence, the Palestinian violence against the Jews, I guess, is like more lethal. It's more serious. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Aside from everything else, it needs to be pointed out that sanctions are based on the idea that there are certain types of crime or certain types of criminals that individual countries cannot handle. Meaning the sanctions regime was created because there were international terrorist organizations or crime syndicates or drug syndicates or things like that fell between the cracks of individual countries' jurisdictions. That is certainly not the case when it comes to people involved in acts of violence in Judea and Samaria. Israel's systems work. People are arrested. People are tried. People who are found guilty are placed in prison. So using sanctions against a functioning democratic society with a functioning judiciary is unprecedented. It doesn't happen anywhere else. That's number one. Number two, look at the situation on the other side. The Palestinian, as I mentioned, the state of Israel has invested millions and continues to invest millions, and rightly so, to prevent or bring to justice anyone involved in violence from the Israeli side. Whereas the Palestinian Authority invests millions in doing the exact opposite, in encouraging terrorism, in paying terrorists and their families salaries, in promoting them when they are released to positions of honor and power within Palestinian Authority. And they named schools after terrorists. They named summer programs for children after murderers. They take great pride in the members of the Palestinian Authority's official police system who are convicted of terrorism, of murdering Israelis. So what's the imbalance here? It's practically unfathomable what the imbalance is. But for some reason, people don't want to look at the clear violation by the Palestinian Authority, and they also don't want to see the narrative of settler violence for what it is, a massive magnification of a very small fringe phenomenon. Because that entire campaign was created to discredit the Jewish presence in Judea and Samaria, the IDF, and the state of Israel as a whole.
Yes. I would like to ask, because I know that you know so much about every incident happening in Judea and Samaria. This is from the Peace Now website, which tells about the other sanctioned organizations like Nahala. And it says about Nahala that it supports the Jewish outposts like the Evyatar outpost, following whose establishment dozens of residents of the nearby village of Beita were killed or injured while protesting against it. Do you know anything about this case?
I don't know enough to speak about it from a place of actual knowledge. I have not researched that incident. What I will tell you is that Peace Now has a tendency to report terrorists killed in action or people who are conducting violent riots against the IDF as victims of settler violence. This is a problem. Again, I encourage people to try to get the facts, and by accepting as gospel, accepting as fact reports by organizations, anti-Israel organizations, and organizations that have been paid by the European Union to create the narrative to begin with, is a very, very slippery slope to go down. We don't base any of our research on hearsay or on reports that come from biased sources. Another thing that I have to add is that I didn't mention is that the United Nations OCHA website that gives this dashboard of settler violence says on it very, very clearly under all of the graphs that all of its reports are based on 2 verifiable independent sources. So all of these reports should have, and the data that we received also, it lists the sources of the reports of this quote unquote of each violent incident. And what we found over and over again is that the sources for this information, and this goes right back to what we were just talking about, the sources of the information are extremely problematic, to put it mildly. Hundreds and hundreds of reports come from one source, which is called 2 different things. It gives the initials of the same Palestinian Authority official body in two different ways of calling the same organization. Meaning it's called one thing in English and it's called another thing in Arabic. They list them as 2 separate sources. And that is both not 2 sources and not an impartial source, right? Taking reports from the Ministry for Resistance to the settlements is not a great impartial source. And calling that one ministry by 2 different names and claiming that those are 2 impartial sources is even more problematic. In a Knesset hearing on the issue of settler violence, the commander of the Judea and Samaria region for the Israel National Police actually testified that at least 50% of the reports of violence that are called into the Israel police that they are asked to investigate turn out to be completely fabricated. So although you get these massive statistics, there were 10,000 complaints filed of settler violence with the Israel National Police. 50% of them right off the bat are simply fabricated by people who are paid by the European Union. They're sitting in a cafe somewhere in Tel Aviv, and they call the police and they say, so-and-so attacked me violently. And then the police spend tremendous amount of time and resources investigating a completely fabricated claim. So just saying that there are reports of violence doesn't really mean that there's violence involved. So many of the sources are so problematic because so much European money is going to create this narrative, to pay people to make it their full-time job, to create confrontations, to edit film footage of confrontations, to sometimes completely fabricate reports. And then people simply repeat these very, very problematic reports without checking what's really behind them.
Yeah. So thinking the steps forward, the international organizations placed on the EU sanctions list have the right to seek the annulment of the decision. Are you planning to appeal this decision?
We're planning on quite a few things. First of all, we're planning to sue the European Union for defamation, for placing us in the same framework as Hamas, for harming our reputation as a research and policy institute and implying that we are involved somehow in violent activity. All of those things have harmed us already, whether or not they make the announcement official or whether or not they officially sanction us. That is a very, very serious problem, and that is what libel laws are about. In addition to that, we intend, if they do go forward, to sue them, first of all, to appeal the decision and to demand that they provide their reasoning, their proof, as it were, the basis for these sanctions, which they have not done. All of these things will be moving forward. In addition, we have contacted members of the European Parliament itself, members of the Israel delegation, the relation to within the European Parliament. We believe that, as always, the vast majority of European Parliament members have no idea what is being done in their name.
Yeah, sure.
And we would like to bring it to their attention that the European Union is actually using their reputation to stifle free speech, to silence dissent, and to undermine the ability to disagree with European Union policy. This is a complete violation of the European Union's own self-description as a community of law and a community of respect for the law. And this is not the way you achieve anything. This is, I believe, somehow or other, somewhere in the back of their minds, they're treating Israel as a colony that can be dictated to. We are not necessarily going to go along with that. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, I hope you don't. That since the pro-Palestinian NGO front is now celebrating, of course, they say that this should be only the beginning. But for us, cooperation with you has been very valuable, and with the other Israeli expert organizations, it's vital to our existence. And I think silencing political opposition and fact-based criticism with sanctioning, and thus making cooperation a criminal act for us, is also very far-reaching and dangerous act. So if the EU is acting like this,
I believe that sanctions against us will have more impact on you and other Europe-based organizations than it will actually have on us. For now, I mean, whether or not the government of Israel actually stands up and officially protests the gross interference in Israel's civil society or not, we don't intend to be silent. But the harm that can be caused to pro-Israel voices in Europe is inestimable.
Yeah, I think it's this is also targeted against us and trying to silence your voice inside the Europe. So it's very important for us also to fight these sanctions. And of course, as EU citizens, because if the EU is acting like this, we, the citizens of the EU will soon be in a big trouble. So this is a wake-up call for everyone appreciating freedom of speech and justice. So yeah, so keep fighting for also for us and for yourselves. So and for the sovereignty of Israel and for the Jewish communities, their right to exist in the ancient heartlands of the Jewish people.
I want to add one thing, and that is that it has become clear that Israel is the treatment of Israel is a symptom of some much, much larger disease.
Yeah.
And I think that the citizens of Europe and the citizens of the United States and Canada and pretty much the entire Western world need to ask themselves, what is really happening? Why is Israel the focus of so much that is going on everywhere else in the world? And the answer to me is that if you look at the very strange coalition that has been created between far left and radical Islam, you begin to realize how unnatural that partnership is. And it also highlights exactly why Israel is right at the center of it. Because Israel stands for everything that both the far left and radical Islam detest.
Yeah.
We are a faith-based nation. We are a family-oriented nation. We are a family, and that's the truth. We are an ancient nation state. We have a distinct national identity and culture and history. Those are all things that the left absolutely detests. And we are the thing that is standing in the way of the Islamic conquest. And
Yeah.
that's what brings those two extremes together. Israel is at the center of these things, but we're not really the ultimate target. We're just this thing that's blocking them from achieving that ultimate target. And that is to take apart everything that is based on Judeo-Christian values, on Western values, and we're in their way.
Yeah.
So that's something that I think people should start thinking about, not just about whether Israel is right or is wrong or is left or is right, whether or not Israelis have done this or that or the other, but why is it such a major issue in the political lives of countries that have absolutely nothing to do with this region?
Yeah, sure. So our time's up. So thank you, Naomi, for this interview. So I'm very happy to have this connection with you, and your expertise have been so invaluable for us. So thank you for everything, and thank you for this interview.
Thank you.
God bless. Bye.